And now I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Lacey Kobriger is a senior mobile product designer at Atlassian. She is an advocate for cross-disciplinary collaboration and has built collaborative practices on digital product teams across industries. Her passion for native mobile design is rooted in collaboration and camaraderie with her mobile development teammates. She attributes much of her success to ensuring her teams are involved in every step of the process, from understanding the problem to shipping final code. We're really excited to have you here, Lacey. Thank you so much. And it's all yours now.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here. I'm just gonna switch over to present my screen here and do all the Zoom organization that one needs to do. Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for joining me. Perfect. Yay. It's half the battle, right? So I'm Lacey Kobriger. I am, as was said in my bio, a native mobile product designer. I'm currently working on Trello at Atlassian, and I'm here today to talk more about working together in Figma. And that is the wrong screen that I just switched. There we go. And that is not the right one either. Get all the weirdness out right in the beginning. All right. So I want to start today off with a story. Many years ago, I was working in a company where I was noticing that designers and developers were having some friction working together. I was noticing that designers would often complain that developers wouldn't participate in their working sessions or their workshops. The feedback that they were getting wasn't super helpful. And in maybe some extreme cases, they felt that the developers were completely shooting down their ideas and they just hated everything that they were making, which is kind of a bummer. Developers also had some complaints. They felt that the designers weren't involving them early enough in the conversation, that there wasn't any transparency to the decisions that were being made. And in some cases, they felt that the designers were way over-promising on what could be delivered, and the developers had to be the bad person in the room and tell the client or stakeholder that they couldn't actually ship what the designer had made. So being the process and design ops nerd that I am, I put together a survey and I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper to what might be going on here so I could find some ways to help designers and developers work a little bit better together, or at least understand each other more. So I asked designers and developers who are working on a project together similar questions. I asked the designers, how often do you collaborate with the developers on your team? Of those that responded, 79% said that they had collaborated with their developers at least once in the past day, which was incredible. I was blown away by that number. I was really excited to see how much collaboration was happening. But I asked developers a similar question. How often do designers collaborate with you? And of those that responded, only 23% that those same designers had collaborated with them within the past day. So there's clearly something going on here. There's definitely a disconnect in how we understand collaboration, how we communicate, and how we work together. And at the time, I thought this was unique to my situation, but after working in a bunch of different environments and a bunch of different companies on a bunch of different teams, I don't actually think it's that unique. So that's where I want to start today, is by talking about ways of working. So as individuals, we work in a variety of different ways, and we often change the way that we work depending on who we're working with, the project, our mood, just a variety of circumstances, and that's normal. But as teams, and for the sake of this talk, when I'm talking about teams, I'm talking specifically about designers and developers working together in some kind of formation. We tend to kind of gravitate towards one of three generalized buckets, and that's what I want to go through today. So we're going to start with collaboration. And if you think back to that survey story, about 20% of the people that responded said that they were collaborating. So what does that actually mean? Well, to me, collaboration is really about co-ownership. It's about designers and developers coming together to really deeply understand the problems they're trying to solve, the goals, ideate on potential solutions, and own the work all the way through shipping, and then learning about what we have shipped and how it impacted our customers and our business. If you want to think more tactically, this is developers being really deeply involved in the design process. They're sketching alongside designers, they're creating flows, they're creating practical prototypes, and the line between design and development becomes really blurry. There's not necessarily a really formal handoff, and there's not a divide between the practices. If you want to think about tools, this is when we try to use similar tools to solve similar problems. So as designers, we are probably getting into developer tools and involved in developer processes. Maybe we're using Jira, maybe we're using other issue tracking tools. Maybe in some extreme cases, we're writing some code, but that's obviously not necessary. Developers are involved in the design process. They probably have an editor access to Figma, editor license to Figma. They're probably sketching and they're playing more of that active role in the design process. So who collaborates? I think any team can collaborate, but I see a lot of smaller, more focused teams being more prone to collaboration because it does take a lot of psychological safety and trust to work this way, to work so close together and to really co-own those solutions. It can be really challenging for people who don't have that personal relationship, who aren't working consistently with groups of people, or who are working across global time zones to find that time to collaborate and that space to collaborate. The next way of working I want to talk about is validation. And again, thinking back to that survey story, most of the designers that said that they were collaborating were actually validating. So what's the difference? Validation is when designers and developers are working separately, but have overlap in the work that they're doing. They're seeking feedback from each other, essentially. So the classic example of this is the designer makes a prototype or a bunch of wireframes and they call over the developer and they say, hey, what do you think? Can we ship this? And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that developer had to switch context to come and give feedback on that work. So they're not immersed in that work. They're not co-owning that work. They kind of have to ramp up on whatever the designer tells them and just react to what they're being told. This is a totally fine way of working, but it's important to keep in mind that we aren't as involved in the work that we're doing. So we need to communicate more proactively, more clearly, and we need to create more robust artifacts. So if you're thinking about tools, there's probably some overlap in tools. Developers might have edit access to Figma, but more than likely, they're probably view only. They're probably leaving comments on files that you share with them to give feedback. As designers, we might go into some developer tools or be involved in developer processes if we're mentioned or someone sends us a link, but we're not necessarily spending as much time together in those shared processes. I think this is a really, really common way for people to work, especially again in those really distributed global teams where maybe a designer's day is a developer's night and there's just not a lot of room for us to collaborate. This can be absolutely necessary. Again, it's just important to keep in mind that because we don't have that shared context and we have those handoffs, that we need to put in some extra effort to make sure that we're communicating clearly and that we're setting up our documentation so it's easy for those people to use, whomever that is. And the last way I want to go through quickly is isolation. And I really like to think about this as the classic waterfall way of working, where designers and developers are pretty much working entirely separately. There's very little visibility into each other's work. There's usually some kind of very formal handoff, and there might be some more formalized check-ins along the way, like maybe a presentation of all the design decisions we've made so far, or maybe a demo, but there's not a lot of shared processes, tools, or ceremonies. I would like to think that not a lot of teams are working this way, but I know that's not true. I know a lot of teams still work in isolation. And I think what's important is because we have to kind of bundle up all of our knowledge and wrap it up into a nice little present and then throw it over the wall and hope that it lands okay, we really have to be mindful of the documentation that we're creating, and it is paramount that people can understand what we're trying to communicate and that we account for some of that ambiguity and maybe some of those wrong assumptions that we're making along the way. So why are we talking all about this? Why do we spend 7 minutes talking about ways of working? Well, it's not to say that one way of working is necessarily better than another, but what is important is how we work affects how we communicate. And at the end of the day, tools like Figma are just artifact creation and communication tools. So it's really important for us to think about how we work, both as individuals, but more importantly as teams, so we can account for that communication style and make sure that we're bringing everyone along on that journey and making things accessible for our users, which as designers making artifacts in Figma is oftentimes developers. So let's get into Figma. What are we going to be talking about today in Figma? We're going to go through some demos, and as best as I can, I'm going to be talking about how the different ways of working kind of tie into different methods of using Figma, different tools. and different ways of documenting things. So if you identify as working more in isolation, validation, or collaboration on your team, maybe you can get some ideas that will really work for you with your working method. We're going to go over some ways of finding information in Figma, which hopefully will be really helpful to developers, especially if you're newer to Figma or not as confident in Figma. But for designers, I hope that this gives you some ideas on how you can make things more discoverable or easier for people to use. We're going to go through the editor experience and the view-only experience of Figma, which you would think is the same. It's not. There's differences in how you get information out of the file depending on your access. And I really want to highlight that so designers can understand what view-only users go through when trying to navigate their files. And if you are a view-only user, you have some clarity on how to get the information you need out of the file. We're going to talk about linking to and sharing information and how designers can use that to make it easier to get into the right section of your file, especially if it's large. And then we're going to go through version history and communicating file changes and give you some ideas on how you can groom your files and keep them really focused for your audience by using version history. And then if we have time, and I hope that we do, we're going to spend a quick minute talking about Figjam and how it can be a really great digital home base for collaborative teams, especially if they're remote. So let's get into Figma. All right. So this is the Figma file we're going to be going through, and this is in view-only mode. So the first thing you'll probably want to do is make sure that you can see the pages over here in a file. If you're getting a generic Figma link, oftentimes this page view is hidden, and all you'll see is the name of the page and a little chevron, and then a huge list of all the layers, sections, and frames in a file. So just come up here and make sure that this is open so you can find everything in the file. I know I've had this happen to me recently where someone was talking about something in a file, I couldn't find it, and it was because the page view was hidden. Another really quick thing that you can do just to get yourself familiar with what's happening in a file, especially if you're working in isolation, where something was handed off to you, you need to find something, or even validation, if you thought you saw something and you want to follow up, or maybe a designer mentioned something. Figma supports searching. It's been around for a little bit, but it's a relatively new feature. So I'm on a Mac today. All the key hotkeys I'm going to be mentioning are going to be in Mac land. I'm pretty sure the equivalent would be Control, but for a Mac user, it's going to be Command F. You can bring up the find or the search window. And let's just try finding something in this file. Let's search for chips. This is an Android demo file, so there should be some chips in here, right? You'll see I get a couple different pieces of information that pop up. The first one is kind of an annotation. So this can be really useful if your designer is writing documentation in Figma and you want to find something specific. You can search for terms and find it, hopefully. And the second thing that shows up is filter chips. So I can see this group of chips here. Awesome. I'm finding information already. But if you have eagle eyes, you might notice that there's actually some chips down here. So why didn't they show up when I searched? This is a really simple and kind of basic example, but in actuality, I would have just need to search for chip without an S to get all the results that I'm looking for, including these filter chips that are over here. So again, this is kind of a silly example, but it also underscores the importance as designers of thinking about how we name things and using language that developers that are looking for information use so they can actually find what they're looking for. If you're using this search functionality, the other thing you'll probably want to know is if you're looking up here where it says 12 results in this page, it's only searching the page that I'm on. And it's very likely that you're trying to find information in a large document and you don't know where it is. So just make sure that you click on this page and select all pages to search the whole document. Okay, so now we have some familiarity on how to find things in this file. What can you actually do in view-only mode? Pretty much two things. The main thing is commenting. So if you come over here to the right-hand side, you'll see the comment tab here. And if you click on that, you'll see all the open comments in the file. You'll also see that the little comment bubble up here is highlighted, and my cursor is now a speech bubble, so I can come in here and leave a comment places. It's pretty easy. It works pretty much exactly how you'd expect. You can also @mention people, which can be pretty nice if you have like a long discussion happening in FigJam or you want to leave a comment and make sure that a specific person sees it. You can just @mention people, pretty much exactly the way you'd expect. And now I have a comment in the file. Wonderful. So something that you might want to do or might be helpful to know is if you come into any comment and you go to this 3-dot menu, you can actually copy a link directly to the comment thread. So if you're having a big discussion in Figma or you want to call attention to something, you can grab a link and say post it in a Jira ticket if you want to reference something, or if you want to make sure, say, a designer sees a comment thread, maybe they haven't responded yet, and you want to make sure that they see it in Slack or Teams, you can do that. The other thing that you'll want to be aware of is the resolve button. So in view only mode, I'm pretty sure you can only resolve your own comments, but in editor mode, you can resolve any comment. Why would you want to resolve comments? That seems scary. It seems like we're losing data here. The nice thing about Figma is they actually have a really nice system for resolving comments where you don't need to worry about data loss. So if I resolve this comment, it cleans it off the screen. So if we have like a back and forth, a Q&A, a feedback, and maybe I've addressed the feedback, you should clear out the comments so it's not sitting around in the file. And the comments that stay in the file are either open items or really helpful items for people who want to get context or need to follow a discussion on why something is the way it is. So if I come over here to this comment panel again, and I come over to this filter icon, I can actually show all the resolved comments. So again, you're not going to lose access to anything that has happened in this file. You can easily reference it. You can search for it, which is wonderful. And the best part is if you've used those links that I showed you how to get and you posted it, say, in a Jira ticket or a Slack channel, that link will still take you to the right comment, even if it's resolved. So that's nice. All right. So the other thing that you probably want to do in a Figma file is get information out of it. So let's zoom into this hi-fi mock-up example and start to get some information out of the file. Let's start with this top app bar, this header here. So if I click on that, you'll see that the Inspect tab is highlighted, and I can see some information about what I have selected. The most notable things you'll probably want to look at are the width and height and the color. Something to note with the size dimensions that you see in Figma is sometimes you'll see little prefixes like this that say hug. This means that a designer is using the auto layout in Figma, and this is not a number that they have manually set. It's basically generated based off the rules that they've set up in their file. So in some cases, this number can be helpful. In a lot of cases, this number can be a trap where it's not actually necessarily 64 pixels in code. It could be something entirely different. So that's just something to watch out for as you're getting information out of a file. The other thing that you see here is the color information. So you see this here, which is actually the color style name that a designer has given a color if it's set up in either their design system that they're referencing or the file that they're working in. So this was built using the Material 3 component library made by Google. So these are all using the material color names. So if I'm an Android developer and I come into a file and I see primary, that could actually mean a lot to me. I might not even need to look at the hex value below. But if I'm an iOS developer or a web developer and I see a material theme light primary, that could mean nothing to me. So as designers, there's opportunity to really think about how we name things like colors, because that could actually be really powerful for developers to save some steps and understand what we're trying to talk about or trying to represent. But if it doesn't mean anything to you, it's okay. The hex value is right below it. And if you need a different format for color, you can just come up to this picker and get what you need. So let's look at this text. You'll notice that I have this header selected and all I can see is the width, height, and color. So we're going to have to dig through this component a little bit to get the information that we need. So let's click on activities and you'll see a similar set of information. Again, the width and height, and you'll see that fill and hug prefix on these sizes. So again, it's using auto layout. This component is generating these sizes for me. So this might not be super relevant to me as a developer. And then you'll see the color information in the same way as you did before. And you'll see the typography styles, which you'll notice some patterns here. So again, this is the name of the style that has been given to this particular font and applied by the designer. So again, if I'm an Android developer, This might be all I need to know. I might just need to know it's headline 5 and then I can carry on with my day. Awesome. If it doesn't mean anything to you, all the styles are available down here, so you can figure out what the designer is intending. So we still don't know anything about these icons. Let's dig into that. So if I hover over and click on the icon, you might notice something right away, especially if you're a mobile developer. This hamburger menu is supposedly 18 by 12. That's weird. And if I come over to this icon, it's 20 by 20. Oh my God. Why are these icons different sizes? Well, it's because of how view only works. So this vector art is actually different sizes, but what we often do is normalize the size of icons. So as a designer, I would expect that these icons would all be 24 by 24 in this top app bar component. But because in view only, you're actually selecting the lowest level of what you're clicking on, you're jumping all the way down to the vector art. You're not actually jumping to that icon group, which is what I would expect to export if I was a designer or developer exporting this. So how do you get to the right level of the icon to export it? There's really only one way to do it, and that's looking at the layers over here. So if you're a designer creating these files, I think that's something to really keep in mind. And there's not always clear answers to this. Sometimes there's trade-offs we need to make on if we want to make our lives easier as designers using a Figma file, or easier for people getting information out of a Figma file. But at a minimum, naming our layers and making sure that there's some kind of logic or structure can make it a lot easier for people to understand the correct layer that they need to get the information out. So I know that this layer right up here is actually the correct layer that I need to select to get the icon information. And you can see over here, it's 24 by 24. Great, wonderful. I can export this, but now I can't see the icon color. So as a developer, you might actually need to click through different layers to get a full picture of what you're trying to create. And I call this out because I don't think that's super clear to developers. I think that's one of the trade-offs of Figma is it can be a little fiddly, especially in view-only mode, to get that full picture. But hopefully as a designer, you're thinking, because this was my reaction when I put together this talk, was I need to be a lot better about how I construct these components and be a lot more intentional about the trade-offs that I'm taking on how I'm putting things together. Because if I had a really bespoke design and I'm working in isolation, so my developer and I aren't really talking a lot, they're just getting artifacts and maybe a handoff, they have to go through every single element in these screens to start to understand what I intended. So documentation is really important in those cases, and creating maybe not even just screens, but also like component guides so people can understand more quickly what is happening. And I would even say that creating a shared design system between code and designers is even better, because then you can start to understand, I'm an Android developer, I'm seeing system standard Android components here, I understand how they work. If you're working in validation, maybe you have those handoff points, so you can validate your understanding. You can make sure that those are just native Android chips, right? Yes, great, wonderful. Maybe write a little note in there. If you're working in collaboration, you're having a lot more involved conversations, you're sketching, you probably have a design system, but even if you don't, you have a shared language around what you're creating. So there's opportunity to reflect that in Figma, and just things to think about as a designer as you're creating this documentation. Again, there's not always a really right, crisp answer, but I think having awareness of the difficulty in view only of getting information out of a file just makes us better designers. The last thing I want to go through really quick is measurements. So how far apart are the chips? Great question. So if I come over here and select the chip, and I just hover over the header, I can see that's 16 points, 16 points, 16 points. And I don't care about the size between the chip and the text of the chip next to it. I want to know about the chip, but I can't select the chip. To be fair, I think this is a bug with Figma, with the way that Material has constructed their chips in their Figma component library. I don't really think it understands what to do with an element that has no background and a stroke. So if you find yourself in a situation where you need to actually select the whole component and not that lowest level, there's a way to do it. So on a Mac, if I hold Command, it'll actually, I'm just hovering over this chip, it'll select that whole component instead of jumping to the lowest layer of the object. So now I can see that these chips are 8 points apart. This can be helpful for trying to group together information also. There is a little bit of aggregation that happens over here, but you can see I have this card component selected and I don't see any information about the chip, or the card, not the chip, excuse me. There's no text. There's nothing about the icons. All I can really see is the background color of the card. So you can see that it's challenging to get information out of view only. So let's contrast that with what it's like to get information out in editor mode. So let's jump over to that. I'm going to do the same thing. Make sure this is not selected. All right. So again, let's start with that header. All right, so within height information, you can see what I'm talking about with the auto layout. This is not a number I can edit, so something to keep in mind. You can see that auto layout information here, and if I scroll all the way down, I can actually see some more aggregated information here, which is helpful. So for the header, I can see we're using both this kind of gray blue color and also this white color. If I want to know where color in this list is being used, I can just come over to this crosshairs and it'll select all the color or all the objects in the component that are using that color. So that can be pretty helpful for getting a quick understanding of where things are applied. If I come over here, you can also see some information about the color usage, but also you can start to see some of that text information. You'll also notice that it's not showing me any of the raw information. It's just showing me that color name. So again, if I'm not an Android developer or I don't understand what these color names are, how do I get information out about what this actually means? There's a couple ways to do it. The first way is if you just click on that color style, it'll select it in the list. Come over to settings, this little settings icon, and then you can get the hex value right here. If you want to save yourself a couple clicks, oops, and completely lose everything, you come down here, you can come up to inspect, and then you can see the type information here. But because I have 3 objects selected, I might have to dig through code to find that color information. So that's a little bit of a trade-off with using inspect, especially if you have multiple objects selected. This design pane actually gives you a little bit more concise information, even if it takes a couple extra clicks, whereas inspect can make it a little bit harder to find that information. This inspect tab is what the view only user will see. So that's also a good way of kind of judging how people access information or how it appears to people in editor mode is by referencing inspect. The text styles work exactly the same way. So if I click on this, it highlights it in the list. I can click on settings and then I can get all of the styles here. And as you saw in inspect, the other way to get it is it breaks it down right here as it did in the view only mode. All right. Let's look at those chips, or not those chips, those icons here. Let's get some information about that. So how do I get to the icon? You'll notice that editor mode is working differently than view only mode. So if I'm hovering over this icon and click, I'm not jumping down to that vector layer like I did in view only. So how do I get to it? There's a few different ways. First way is you can obviously dig through the layer list. And again, having well-named layers and well-constructed components can make this a lot easier to navigate and quickly understand where information is. But you have some other options too. You can double click and it will walk you down each level of the layer tree. So you see I've double clicked, it's selected leading icon. I have to double click again, and now I'm on container. And then I double click again, and now I'm on a state. And now I double click again, and I'm finally at the icon. So you saw this happening a little bit in view only too. And again, these are the components made by Google in the Material 3 component kit. So I don't know exactly why this is constructed this way, but my guess is that these extra layers exist to make it easier for a designer to modify and use this header and represent different states without using a bunch of different components. So they've chosen to skew more towards designer usability than maybe developer or consumer usability, which is sometimes trade-offs that we need to make, but it's also worth being really aware of those trade-offs. So now I'm at the correct icon layer. I can see some more information about this icon. This is the inspect view. So again, I'm having that same issue where I can only see width and height. I can't see color. But if I'm over on the design tab, I can see width and height and the color at the same time. Wonderful. So how else can I get to this icon if I don't want to double click through a bunch of layers? If you're on a Mac and you hold Command, it'll do the same thing that view only did, but in inverse. It's confusing. I'll give an example and then repeat. So in editor mode, if I just click on something, it's selecting that whole object, that whole component, that whole group, the highest level of the thing. If I want to jump down to the lowest level of the thing and I hold Command, that's how I get to it. In view only, it's the exact opposite. If you're just hovering around and clicking on things, you're going to go to the lowest level of whatever you're hovering on. If you want to select the biggest level or the whole thing, you have to hold Command to do it. So you can see even a simple task like making a selection in a file is very different in view only in editor mode, and it can cause some confusion when trying to get some information out of the file. So the last thing we're going to go through is that chip measurement again. So let's click on these chips, and you'll notice that as I'm hovering over things, I don't get any sizing information or any relationship size spacing information. So on a Mac, I need to hold Option, and that's what brings up the measuring tool to be able to see how far apart things are. But I want to know how far apart the chips are. There's a couple ways to do this in editor mode that you don't get in view only. The first is if you come out over to auto layout, you can see how these chips were set up. So I put these in a group and applied auto layout. So when I change the state or the text in the chip, the sizing and the spacing relationships of the chips stay the same. So I can actually look at the horizontal space row here, and I can see these little pink boxes between the chips. And I can see that these are actually 8 points apart, which is pretty nice. But I don't always trust auto layout. Things can happen where it's not always clear, or maybe that number isn't super intentional. I just really want to measure what they are. So again, you need to click down to the layers to get out of this group and actually select the chip. And to measure the space between something, it doesn't come up on hover automatically. On a Mac, I need to hold Option, and then I can see that it's 8 points apart. Unlike view only, there's no extra hoops. There's no bugs with not being able to select an object that has a transparent background and a stroke. So I really just need to hold Option, and then I can see the spacing information. So when I put this talk together, I went on this journey of figuring out what was maybe the most valuable to go through. And when I was going through these examples of view only versus editor, I learned so much about how tedious it is to get information out of this file. So I hope that's what people are starting to pick up on as we go through this exercise is A, as a developer, how do I do it? And B, as a designer, how can I make it better for my users, my developers, or other designers who are trying to use this file, especially in view only. All right. So let's talk about sharing information and making things more easy for people to consume or find information kind of as a designer or someone creating something in editor mode. So just like in view only, a good first step is making sure they can see all the pages. So if I come up here and click, this is actually the name of the page I'm on. So it'll vary depending on what it says, depending on your file, but that'll show the page view here so I can make sure I'm seeing everything. Something I like to do is instead of sharing that generic Figma link that I might get here, I really like to get people to the most relevant section of the file that I can. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. So we're going to go through a couple different layers that you can link to. So the first is with pages. If you right click, you can get a link directly to that page. And that's great if you're a more collaborative team and you want to get people into a page so you can start ideating or sketching or working on something. Wonderful. If you're working in isolation or validation especially, you're probably going to want to get people to a more specific section of the file. So one of the things I like to use is sections. This is a relatively new feature to Figma. It's not super new. It's probably been around for 6 months, but for many of you, it could be new to you. Sections are really great for organizing information instead of just grouping frames together because you can link to them consistently. So if I change the name of the section, if I move the section, if I change the content within the section, basically, as long as I don't delete the section, or move it to a different page, the link I get will take me to the right spot of the file, which is great, especially with really big or complex files. So to get a link, you just have to right click, copy paste as, which I don't know why the option is called that. It took me forever to find this when I first started using Figma, but it's copy paste as, and then copy link, and that'll get you a link directly to this section. You can do the same thing with frames, just right click, copy paste as, copy link. So you can really find the right level of what you want to share with people to make it a lot easier to get people right into that correct section of the file. If you're thinking about working in isolation, maybe as a designer, you can create documentation that links people directly to what you're talking about, and maybe it's paired with annotations, maybe in a Google Doc or Confluence page or whatever documentation tool you happen to use. If you're working in collaboration, it can still be helpful for just getting people again to that right section of the file and making sure that collaboration is happening in the right place. The other thing that you might notice is I have these little blue notes here. And this is just an example. I think there's a lot of ways that you could use notes or build upon this pattern, but I just want to talk a little bit about this example here. So even when you're working really collaboratively, things can move really quickly and people forget things. So this was actually in response to some feedback I got a few months ago from a developer when we were working really collaboratively. Is they mentioned, I can't remember what we changed in this file. And that's the blessing and the curse of Figma, is it's so easy to come in and change things, but it's so easy to miss things that change too. So a really simple way of keeping track of what's going on is just adding a note to your sections, or even paired next to the frames that you're working on, of the state, the last time you updated it, and then just a quick note on what changed. And that can make a huge difference in just being able to track what's going on in your file, if things have changed recently, and if people need to pay attention to a particular section. The other thing I really like to do is use version history. So if you come up here to the name of the file and click on this little chevron and click on version history, that was not what I wanted to click on, version history, you can see a list of everything that has been saved in this file. And I'm just using the free version of Figma for this demo, so you can only see 30 days, but if you pay for Figma, you can see all of history for forever, which is awesome. So looking through these, you can see the different states that I've saved. If I want to recall information, I can do that pretty quickly just by clicking on any save, and it will jump me to a preview of that state that I've saved. And you notice that things that are changing in this file are pretty subtle, which I think is true for a lot of files, especially maybe as designs are getting more firmed up. You're not going to see these big sweeping changes, which is where those notes can really come in handy to just call out like, hey, this was updated or changed. But also writing helpful notes in these commits make it a lot easier to find what you're looking for. I like to add versions, new versions to the version history whenever I'm about to remove something, before a working session, after a working session, after I complete a task or a big piece of work that I'm working on for the day, or at a minimum at the end of every day. And I also really like to remove things from my files. I really don't like graveyard pages or graveyard sections, especially if you're working more in isolation or validation, where there's that handoff of documentation and people have some kind of onus of navigating your file and figuring out what's real and what isn't. Graveyard sections are super confusing. So if you're working in isolation or validation, I would really encourage you to just remove the things you don't need anymore. So for example, say we've finished our sketches and we're moving into hi-fi and we've kind of completed that process. I'm just going to remove the sketching session. It's not relevant anymore to my work. So I'm going to go to show version history. I'm going to hit this plus. I like writing the name of the page where the change is happening. It's documentation, and then what's happening. See, I've done this before, so I'm going to cheat. Quick update. And then I might write just a quick description of why I'm making this change or what's changing. Again, it doesn't need to be a novel, but it just needs to be enough for you or someone else to understand what has changed. Then I'm going to hit save. And then I'm going to come into the file and I'm going to delete this. You can see what I was talking about with orphan comments here before. I would probably need to resolve this. And again, don't need to worry about data loss in that regard either. And this keeps my file way more focused. It reduces the file size, and it's a lot easier to find information. If we continue to work and we want to reference those sketches down the line, I just have to come up here, show version history. And again, I'm writing helpful commit messages. So I can click. Here's where the sketches were. Awesome. And if I want to revert back to this file, I just have to go, or the state of the file, I just have to go to this 3-dot menu, restore this version, and it'll bring my sketches back. So if you want to get something back and edit it, you can just revert, get what you need, and then paste it back into the file. You're not going to lose any information between commits. So say I rolled all the way back to this one, it basically just makes a copy of that state and adds it to the top of the list. So you don't need to worry about anything getting removed or erased between those states. I've been using version history for a while, and I can think of maybe twice that I've actually had to revert a file back to get something out of it. Most of the time, I'm able to just click through and remember, oh, that's right, that's why we didn't do that thing. Okay, well, this doesn't need to be a conversation. And then I don't need to actually revert it. I can just get away with previewing it. So there's a lot of power in version history. I think it's something worth playing around with and seeing what works for your workflow, but it's going to keep your files so much more focused for other people to find what they need, and it can help you make more effective documentation. All right, so let's jump back over to this. We talked a lot about a lot of things. We could have gone a lot deeper. We could have honestly spent another hour just talking more specifics about Figma, but what are some of the key takeaways of what we talked about today? Use version history. If you don't use it today, I hope it's something that you explore as a designer, and as a developer, I hope you now know that this exists and a little bit more on how it's used. The one downside with version history versus something like Abstract or Git with Sketch, which is what I used to use before I started using Figma, is there's no diffing. So that's where those notes really come into play, and like leaving little updates on what's actually changing can be really helpful for people to quickly understand what's happening in a file. So version history plus notes can be a really great strategy to play around with. Design systems and reusable components can reduce the cognitive load of other people coming into your file and understanding what you're trying to communicate. Bespoke screens take a lot of time, especially in view-only mode, to understand. And if your documentation isn't really supporting what's changing, it can be even harder to understand what you intend, especially if you're working in isolation and you don't have that open line of communication. And then give feedback on documentation. If you're a designer, create space for people to give you feedback on your documentation. It can be hard. It can feel kind of crappy sometimes, but it makes it so much easier and so much more valuable to our team, and allows us to work more effectively together if we're working in isolation, validation, or collaboration. If you're a developer, I hope you got just a hint at some of the things that you can do in Figma to make documentation easier to use and how to get the information out of it that you need. So maybe you're a little bit more armed to give feedback and offer suggestions to design if you don't think that documentation is hitting the mark today. All right. Figjam. I do want to talk about this very quickly. So in editor or view-only mode of Figjam, there's really not a lot that you can do. Just like in Figma, you can add comments, and it works exactly the same way as it does in Figma. And you can follow people if they're presenting. But basically, view-only Figjam is the peanut gallery of the workshop. So if you are a designer running a workshop, it's really hard for people in view only to participate or do anything other than leave comments or follow you. I think Figjam is really powerful when everyone has editor access. This can become a great tool for writing documentation, creating collaborative working sessions, and just breaking down the barriers between design and development. The nice thing about Figjam also is a lot of the things that we just went through in Figma apply here also. So if you learn one, it's really easy to learn the other. You'll notice that I'm using sections to organize information. You'll also notice that there's no pages. So keeping Figjam focused and organized is really, really important. I use version control in the same way. So if we don't need information anymore, I will save a state. I will delete it, and then I'll keep working. And then if I ever need to recall that information again, I can just come up to version history and grab it. So as we're working through a design process, or aiding on things really early, maybe we're doing a lot of workshops, maybe we're doing a lot of sketching. Once we start to move into final decisions, I start removing that stuff just to keep our file focused and organized. You can link directly to sections, just like I was showing in Figma, except it's a little bit easier. It's a top level option. You just have to come here to copy a link. So I might build a table of contents that link directly to sections, or if I want someone to look at something specific in a Figjam file, or if I want to link to it in, again, a third-party documentation tool, I try to get to that correct level of documentation to get people to what they probably need the most. If you want to use Figjam for working sessions, it can be really powerful, really flexible, and super fun. One of the nice things about using Figma and Figjam together is it's really easy to share information between the tools. So if I come over to Figma and I grab this screen, I can just come over here and paste in. It maintains the fidelity. I don't need to worry about loss of quality, and it even maintains some editability, although it's mostly limited to text right now. But that can still be nice if you're making hi-fi mocks or bringing in concepts if you want to tweak copy. It's just one less trip copy paste between Figma and Figjam, which is pretty nice. And if I want to bring this back into Figma, I can also do that, but you can see it becomes a frame again and completely editable. So there's a lot of power there. If I want to use it for sketching, another thing that you can do is if you bring in individual components, so if you have a design system or you have a library of reusable components, you can bring in those components. And the nice thing is you can access the variants. So it makes it really easy to sketch up concepts that align with your existing design system and just throw ideas down really quickly, regardless of if you're a designer or developer. I like to call these paper dolls because we're kind of just using our pieces and reorganizing them. You can also come down here and use the pen tool to sketch things if you want, but sometimes it's nice to have a little bit more fidelity than what you can achieve with the pen tool. There's a bunch of different tools for creating documentation and brainstorming. So you can create sticky notes just by coming down here, grabbing a sticky note. There's a bunch of options in here for text sizing and formatting, bold. You can change the color of your sticky note. And by default, your name will appear on a sticky note, which is great for brainstorming and making sure you know who wrote down what sticky note if you want to follow up. But if you're just writing an annotation or a quick note, you can also hide your signature if you want to. If you come down here, you can grab the stamp tool. And the nice thing about stamps is they stick to the sticky note. So that makes reorganizing ideas in a brainstorming session super easy. You can see the flexibility and how much power is behind this. The last thing I want to go through, well, I guess there's two more things. The second to last thing I want to go through is creating flows. Figma doesn't really have a way of creating flows natively that is enjoyable. Figjam has awesome flowchart tools, and it's very possible that they will add those to Figma. That seems to be the pattern with Figma/Figjam. But for now, if you just pull in a shape from the toolbar, I can quickly start to create flows just by clicking on these little blue dots. I can change the connector types just by clicking in, get a bunch of different options, and I can change the shape and the color. So this is really great for making architecture diagrams, flows, or just doing early ideation to try to understand an idea. It's really easy and really low friction for everyone to come in here and start jamming. So I really like the flow tools in Figjam. And if I just copy it, I can paste it directly into Figma too. And it even works. It's great. The last thing is using Figjam for final documentation. So as I was talking about with copying links directly to frames and copying information directly between Figma and Figjam, I'll just copy in content from Figma into Figjam, and we can quickly add notes and annotations. Again, if we're using a strong component system, a design library, developer might not need more information than what they're seeing here. They might understand it. But I always add links directly to that content in Figma. So if they really want to get in and understand type styles or color or components, it'll take them directly to that frame. So there's so much that you can do within this tool, and it's really, really powerful when you can all get in there and collaborate together. Figjam strategies, very quick. Again, we could have a whole talk just on Figjam, but if you're a collaborative team, especially if you're remote or hybrid, it can be a great virtual home base. It's probably one of the best tools if you already use Figma to have digital whiteboarding and sessions on the internet, on Zoom calls. Sharing between Figma and Figjam is super easy. It really is just as easy as copy and paste, and it keeps a lot of the fidelity of what you're copying and pasting between the tools. And then it's great for workshops and documentation. This is primarily what I'm using with my collaborative teams to create all of our documentation, to house all of our brainstorming, and everything is really centralized. You can create links to other content and links between content. So it's really powerful, and the limit is really just your imagination. Even if you're working more in validation, if you want to have more collaborative sessions, as long as everyone has editor access to Figjam, that can be a great option for you. In isolation, Figjam might not make a lot of sense unless your designer's working with other designers. Very quick, what's the difference between Figma and Figjam? Why would you use one over the other? If Figjam is such a great documentation tool, why would I use Figma? Figma is a artifact creation tool for prototypes, design systems, wireframes. Pretty much anything that is a designer would be making is probably going to be created in Figma. That's its strength, is documentation creation, or artifact creation, I should be more specific. Figjam is a whiteboarding tool. It's super collaborative, super low friction. It's much easier to learn and get in and use, and it can make it a really powerful documentation tool in that way. And because of that connectivity between Figma and Figjam, it makes it really easy to share information, but one isn't necessarily a replacement for another. Being a more collaborative team, we spend a lot of time in Figjam, and I'm just bringing my artifacts over from Figma into Figjam, and people don't really need to go into Figma that much, which is great. But depending on how you work, if you're working more in isolation, Figjam might not make any sense at all. You might need to have everything housed in Figma. If you're working in validation but want to have some more collaborative ceremonies, maybe Figjam is a good choice for you. If you're a collaborative team, I love both. All right, let's wrap it up. Going long, got a lot of things to say. Could say a lot more. So what are the main things that I want to leave you with today, or the things that I hope really stood out to you? These are just tools, and they can either empower teams or block teams. And it's really all about how you work together. We talked about Figma today, but a lot of the things, a lot of the themes that we talked about today could apply to any tool. No matter how you work, artifacts should serve the team. We really need to think about our users when we're making documentation. If we're making the most beautiful, perfect Figma file, but our developers can't get the information they need out of the file, it's not a good artifact. Perfection isn't realistic, but we can always strive to do better. Progress. And then, is your teamwork style working for everyone? Have you ever talked about it? Was there a style that we went through that really resonated with you of like, yes, we do that. Do you like that? Does it work for you? It's worth retroing. If your team doesn't have retros normally, it could be worth a special session. We talked about so many things today. We could have talked about so many more. You can get a link to the slides up in the corner with this QR code if you want to grab that. But I included links to pretty much everything that we talked about today, and some things that we didn't quite go so deep in. If you want a more 101 level of how to use these features, or more documentation, Figma has fantastic documentation and resources if you want to continue to learn how to use Figma better. Also have links to the Figma and Figjam files if you want to make a copy and explore those more. And of course, you can find me on LinkedIn and my website, Design Better Apps. I would love to hear from you. And we have exactly 1 minute left, so I don't know how the question situation is going to go, but let's open it up for questions.
This was so awesome. If you look at the comments, you'll see all the love that you're getting from designers and developers alike. Like, this is super beneficial for all of us, like so many takeaways. And there's so much to think about as a designer. Like, you folks think about the UX for the end user, but there's also the UX for us as devs.
Yes.
So, yeah, this has really been amazing. And we do have some questions, but I know it's the end of time. So if you need to get going, then that's fine. If you can stay for a couple, we can go over a couple of questions. Okay, great. Let me know when you need to go. So yeah. So they just had this question. This is the most difficult part. I get the Figma link in a Jira ticket, and that does not zoom into a specific screen. And it is difficult to understand what to implement. The question is how to focus on the correct page or component using a link.
Mood. I understand this. This was part of the catalyst for why I wanted to talk about ways of working and spend some time on talking about how to link to specific pieces of documentation. So I would assume that you're probably working in isolation or maybe validation if you're just getting a link and you're not sure what to do and you don't feel like you can ask, or maybe it's hard to ask. I would really give that feedback to your designers, even if you don't have a lot of one-on-one relationships with them, to link to what they're talking about in the file using the methods that I was showing before, where you can just right click on any element in a file and get you to what you actually need. If you're getting these generic links to Figma files, using pages can be helpful. Hopefully your designers use pages with logical names. Again, that's a challenge. But using that search function can also be helpful if they're writing documentation or you have some inclination of the words that they're using to find components. But I just really feel for this comment because this really highlights how important it is for us as designers to do better. Because if we have unorganized files with bad names and we aren't writing documentation and we're just lobbing it over the fence to our developers, you aren't going to find anything. And it is really difficult to figure out what to implement. Heaven forbid there's a file where all of the ideations are just like spread out everywhere and there's just an arrow that's like, implement this one. That is not helpful. So I would really try to connect with your designers and give some of this feedback so they can help you find what you need to implement the right thing. But there are some workarounds as a developer that you can kind of like cheat the system, again, assuming your designer has thrown you any kind of lifeline in this file creation, but hopefully that's helpful.
Definitely. And Faye has a question on, is version control available for both editor access and view only access?
Yes, so you can see, I can actually jump over to this. I'm still sharing my screen. In view only, I believe you can, go up to show version history by clicking on that file name. And you can see all of the saves here. So if your designer is really good about making commits or new versions when they're making updates along with those notes, you can click through and see those state changes, but that's pretty much all you can do. You can't really revert. I think a better way of doing this, especially if a common thing that I've heard happening is you kind of have that handoff moment and the designers continue to work in those files. As designers, we shouldn't do that. We should either make a copy of the file and just work entirely separately in a different file so we're not changing information out from our developers in isolation or validation. If you're working in collaboration and you have like a really good understanding of your workflow in Figma, you could potentially get away with making a new page, but I wouldn't do that if there's any kind of handoff, just because, again, it's so easy to have these pages hidden and not realize you're looking at the wrong thing and building the wrong thing. So yes, you can access version history, and it can be helpful for kind of tracking those changes if you're working in validation or collaboration and there's some things happening and you just want to catch up in combination with those notes. But it's not an excuse to keep working in a file if you've done a handoff and you're said this is done, now go build this. There's other things that we can do to manage that. So hopefully kind of reading between the lines of your question, but yes, and don't do that as designers.
Yeah, it's reminding me of how as developers we create different branches and so we don't want to take chances with that. So Lauren, by the way, is the designer in my team, so I'm so happy she's here. So she has a question. Do you have any advice for pointing devs towards prototypes within Figma and how to walk them through the prototype?
Admittedly, I haven't used the prototyping feature very much in Figma. I feel really lucky to be working on such a collaborative team where a lot of the prototypes that we do are actually in code. So we're moving pretty quickly from sketching into prototyping, but I would assume that a lot of the same methods that you use for documentation discovery could be used for prototypes. I know you can link directly to a prototype. So if you want to make sure that people see that part of the file, I would actually create documentation or have a list of links where it's like, here's the sketches, here's the final mocks, here's some documentation, and then here's the prototype, and link them directly to that most relevant section of the file, because it can feel like a corn maze in a Figma file if you don't know there's a prototype and you're supposed to look at it. You can also add links to Figma within Figma. which I was doing a little bit in the Figjam file, if you want to look at that. Basically making a table of contents. That's another way that you could call attention to a prototype if you want to make sure that people see that.
Awesome. And then there's one last question. Figma is paid for more than X projects, right? If yes, is Figjam bundled in the same payment or is it separate? If you
This is a good question. So when we started using Figjam, it was bundled with Figma. I don't know if it is anymore. In fact, I'm under the impression, don't quote me on this. This is a good thing to look at on the Figma website. I think you can purchase the licenses separately. I don't know what the cost is. And I know that they've changed this a couple times in the past couple of years that I've been using Figma. So it's worth looking into. That was one of the main reasons we started using Figjam, is because we didn't have Figma licenses for our developers. And it was a really easy story to be like, let's use this free tool that integrates with Figma. And now it's paid, but I'm under the impression that it is a separate license and not as expensive as Figma. But don't quote me on that. I am not a Figma representative. Their website has a lot more information on this than I do. I'm sorry.
Well, this is great. And yeah, thank you so much, Lacey. I know you put a lot of effort and thought, and I mean, I really appreciate it. And I know everyone else out here really, really loved the session. I also shared the slide deck that you had shared with me, and yeah, this was amazing, and we hope to have you again with us soon. Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for having me.
Joining us. Yeah.